Michal, would you like to introduce us to the ambassadors or?
Of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. It's a research center in University of Haifa, who is centered on the rule of law under extreme conditions. And we have 8 researchers from both Israel and Germany, Haifa University and Hamburg University, who are researching extreme conditions and from a legal point of view. So we have with us Professor Gad Barzilai and Dr. Itamar Mann, both are PIs at the center, and Dr. Robert Neufeld, who is a postdoc at the center. So maybe, Julia, you can start?
Yes, so I just wanted to distribute one more time. I know the people from the Russian embassy, from Kazakhstan embassy, from United States embassy was registered, but I didn't see them right now. So yes, let's start because we have no time. So my name is Julia Verdel, and nice to meet you, Mr. Ambassador of Albania. We never met before, so it's a good opportunity. I'm a PhD in political philosophy from the Bar-Ilan University. And the last 28 years, I'm the CEO of the Diplomatic Club in Israel. We actually provided the meetings, personal meetings, roundtable discussions since 1998, and I always afraid of the political issues. But you know, the latest war between Israel and the Hamas organization in Gaza resembled the previous major rounds of fighting in 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. Hamas firing rockets at Israeli population centers day after day, Israel launching airstrikes at Hamas military infrastructures, ending in a brokered case fair. Hamas celebrated the victory as Israelis engaged in the various debate over the outcome. My first question is, when defense or military actions are considered for the protection of the state and citizens? Professor Gad Barzilai, can you explain the difficulties of the situation right now?
Thanks very much. So thanks, Julia, first of all, for organizing all of that. And I will be very brief, and later on, probably Professor Itamar Mann and Professor Neufeld, who are experts on international law, would refer to it more in depth. But by and large, we justify military action, whether it would be at a limited scale or at a larger scale, is legal and legitimate if it's for self-defense. So the issue of self-defense, including in the UN Charter and in political philosophy and in philosophy of law, would be the main yardstick to evaluate whether a military action is justified or not. Now, what is a self-defense? It's an attempt to activate a force in order to forestall, to cancel, to abolish, to uproot an immediate danger to the national existence of the nation state. Whether those circumstances prevailed at the outset of the current warfare in Gaza, probably we may discuss it later on. But the main issue is self-defense and facing an immediate danger to national existence.
Okay, and now, so can we understand exactly what the international law permitted? How the Hamas can use the civilians for the arms. How this happened? Who is judge of this war against the citizens, actually? Because if the Hamas put the military and defense into the houses of the people, so the civilians going to be dead, right, Itamar?
Thank you for this meeting, and it's good to meet both ambassadors. So I actually prepared answers to all of your questions, and I'll start with the second question which you pose, which is, as you say, why does international law permit the use of civilians by Hamas? Why is there no punishment by international war for forces that exploit civilians? This is the wording that you sent us. And I would like to first kind of question this premise, which is that international law permits this kind of activity. So in general, what we have in this context, and I think that you're referring to, is the doctrine of the idea of human shields. When a military actor or a civilian actor that is directly participating in hostilities uses the civilian population in order to guard itself in a way that is not voluntary on the side of the civilian population, then they are committing a war crime. So international law does not permit this behavior. And indeed, we can see in the recent summary of the preliminary examination by the ICC prosecutor, as you know, there's also an examination there's now an investigation directed against Hamas. And among the issues that are identified in this investigation is this issue of human shields. You see this in the highlighted area of the paragraph from the summary of the preliminary examination, that using protected persons as shields is part of what the ICC is examining as an accusation against members of Hamas. So I just think that the premise is not correct. International law does not permit this behavior. Now, the question whether the remedies are effective or not is a good question, and is a question that oftentimes is raised with regard to international legal institutions. However, I think that it's not a good starting point for us to simply assume that international law permits this. I think that what we're looking at is how to enforce the existing premise in international law, which is that the civilians are protected, and that if they're not voluntarily participating, they have to remain protected. Now, of course, there is a question in certain circumstances whether civilians are really actually participating and shielding in a willful way. And in those circumstances, commentators, international lawyers have sometimes suggested that that renders a civilian a participant in hostilities, and therefore they may become a permissible target for military action. But that is not, I think, the kind of cases that you are thinking about when you're asking this question. So that remains my general answer for now.
Can I receive it after the written? We will publish it in the Diplomatic Lab magazine. Can you send me after that in the written somehow by mail? I would like to publish it in the Diplomatic Lab magazine because I think it's very, very interesting answer and explanation of the situation. So we will continue. Mr. Ambassador, probably you have some questions. Ambassadors, probably you have some questions.
So thank you very much, Vlada, and also all professors. So the Hamas as categorized as terrorist organization. In this context, Israel cannot directly negotiate with the Hamas because of the anti-terrorist law, also United States and other countries. So in this situation, if before avoiding the war, how to manage and how to establish the mechanisms to solve this kind of issues. Thank you very much.
Well, I will refer to it again quite generally, and later on, maybe Professor Mann and Dr. Neufeld can look into it from an international legal perspective. I should say that I'm not convinced that Israel does not really negotiate with Hamas. Certainly, you have informal negotiations with Hamas, because Israel does allow a limited amount of medicine, electricity, and water resources to go into Gaza. It cannot be done without some informal negotiations with Hamas. And you are a professional diplomat, so you would understand it better than I do. However, usually you have in the middle, you have negotiations through Egypt. I would believe also other countries, and including the China, United States, and I would guess, but I don't know, also Russia. So I think that the main issue is not whether Israel does or doesn't have formal negotiations with Hamas, because informal negotiations do take place. Now, Hamas was elected by the Palestinians in Gaza in 2005. So I should say that even the Hamas is indeed defined by dozens of countries as a terrorist organization, at some point Israel would have to negotiate with Hamas. You don't negotiate with your friends, you are negotiating with your enemies. From an international legal perspective, I would suggest that the main issue are not formal negotiations. The main issue would be asymmetrical conflict. So now, if we are looking into possibilities of international legal inquiries into the war in Gaza, also based on the UN Human Rights Council, the main challenge is how you judge such a conflict, how you understand it.
And who is the judge? And who is the judge?
Taking into account that this is by nature asymmetrical conflict. Taking into account that Hamas is certainly using civilians for its purposes. Taking into account that you cannot bombard without taking into account civilians among the Palestinians who might be killed or injured. So this is a very blurry, messy business, how you really judge it from an international legal perspective, taking into account asymmetrical conflicts. And international law does not necessarily offer us good responses to asymmetrical conflicts. It's still somewhat ill-equipped to deal with those issues. But I think that Robert and Itamar would like to drill into it in depth.
I would like just to add, Mr. Ambassador, that you have to differentiate between a sovereign action and a personal, something which is done in a personal capacity. There is no question that certain anti-terrorist legislation all over the world will not allow any connection, negotiation, discussions between individuals in their personal capacity with terrorist organizations. It doesn't mean that a state in a sovereign position cannot decide to deal with terrorist organizations. We had it with the PLO in the Oslo Accords. At that time, the PLO was rendered as a terrorist organization under Israeli legislation, and people were even indicted for meeting with Yasser Arafat at that time. We had these issues here in Israel. So as a sovereign act, there is a possibility for the state to discuss with whoever the state wants to discuss with. Okay, we see it with the Americans discussing with the Taliban now, and we see it all over the world. Okay, so it's not a question of at the end of it, it's an issue of policy, the question of how does the state wants to handle its interests. Does it want to give Hamas the position and the capacity of being treated as something that is more legitimate in the eyes of others? If you discuss with them, maybe we can do that too. This kind of issues and discussions that are exceeding the legal perspective, okay? And if I already spoke and said a few words, I want to build on what Professor Barzilai and Professor Itamar Mann were presenting before, and the questions about, and your questions about the issues of use of civilians, by showing you some slides that will make things even, I think, more difficult, but a bit more clear to understand how difficult it is to differentiate, to discriminate, to use the laws of war properly when you fight in Gaza. Okay, so I'll share a small short presentation just to give you some examples. Okay, so anyway, so here are some examples that are taken up from the 2014 clash. It's not recent, but I'm sure there's nothing much change from that. When Israeli forces operating in Gaza entered some Gazan neighborhoods, they found this manual of the Hamas military wing, actually stating its strategy and its tactics. Here you say this in the translation, saying that the soldiers and commanders of the IDF must limit their use of weapons and tactics that lead to harm, to unnecessary loss of people and destruction of civilian facilities. It is difficult for them to get most of their firearms, especially supporting fire, like artillery. So the manual goes to explain that the presence of civilians creates many pockets of resistance against the advancing IDF troops, and this causes difficulties such as problems opening fire, problems controlling the civilian population during the operations, and providing assistance and first aid to civilians. So what you see is a strategy of the use. It's not only forbidden, it's part of a strategy to use civilians' presence as something that helps Hamas during its war efforts. Here's another, just one of many examples for a military or a target that Israel had decided to, at that time, I understand, to attack. There is an opening of a tunnel belonging to Hamas that it used to infiltrate Israel and carry out attacks. You see in its proximity, it's just near a school, a mosque, civilian houses all over. Now the question is, and this is the dilemma that the practical dilemma that is the IDF is facing, is how do you attack such a thing? Okay, you have to aim under international humanitarian law. You have to attack a military objective. Well, this will probably constitute a military. The tunnel will constitute a military objective under international military law and the laws of war. But then there are other considerations that you have to take into account. The issue of proportionality, the precautions you have to take under law to attack it. At the end of it, it would be if an attack would be unproportionate, it is also illegal at the end of the issue. So the question is, how do you attack such an issue, such a target, and what collateral damage should be allowed in that situation. This is what the presence of civilians on civilian objective, how it's actually been, when you put it into a photo, this is the challenge of fighting in that premises. We also see it, and we see it now, that firing mortars just all around an UNRWA school, for example. That's another example. And you have received, for example, a manufacturing site for rockets, just meters, 4 or 6 meters near civilian houses. Okay, usually if there's an arms cache, even secondary explosions should be part of your consideration of the proportionality in that issue. For example, if there are rockets in this place and they explode, and you as an officer know that's what you're attacking, and there's a risk that they explode, you should also take into account that secondary explosions that you may cause as part of your proportionality discussion. And it so goes on. You have clinics near targets. You have mosques used as themselves as a military objective. And when you look at, for example, Beit Lahia, a very dense population in Beit Lahia, and you see where rockets are being fired and where military facilities are located, you see all the red and yellow, green lights all over, and the X's, which are weapon caches, all over the civilian neighborhood of Beit Lahia. And this is another example for where rockets are being fired from the Gaza Strip. Okay, the Israeli systems can locate the exact point of that from where the rockets are fired, and you practically see it all over the Gaza Strip, mainly Gaza City, which is, of course, the main city in Gaza. So these slides are just to show you the actual practical, how these questions come into reality in practice. I may not have all the good answers for every situation, but these are the dilemmas at the end of it when you fight in this neighborhood, if you wish. So
the situation is very difficult. The situation is very difficult.
Yes. The decisions, there is no good decisions in this case. In any case, the decision to attack may cause collateral damage. It's inherent into this conflict, and that's it. That's the one thing about international humanitarian law. It must be stated. It's not the fact there is a civilian casualty does not say there's immediate war crime happening. Okay, civilians and civilian property can find themselves, unfortunately, as collateral damage. It's not necessarily deems the action as illegal. The question is whether the attacking side did the right actions and calculations as to the precautions necessary to be taken, and at the end of it, as to the proportionality. Proportionality is also something that you take into account with the information that you had, or you should have had before taking the action. The fact that you release a bomb where you had the information that no one is around, and that bomb at the end of it, because of your lack of information, or there was something that you didn't know at that time, had causes civilian casualties does not necessarily deems the action as illegal. The commander is judged by the information that he had beforehand and the action that he has done as precautionary measures before making his decision. That's as to international law.
Yeah, let me just add following what Robert told you. I don't think that any professor in Israeli academia, any scholar in Israeli academia is taking lightly unfortunate cases where civilians and children were killed. And we are university professors. We don't belong to any government. We don't, and certainly not to any political party. My personal opinion is that any case where civilians and children particularly were killed should be looked into. And personally, I don't have any objections that it would be done by an international committee of inquiry. Obviously, that committee should also look into Hamas and the fact that Hamas is shooting indistinctively on civilians. But since Israel professes to be a democracy, and since Israel would like to do justice, at least at the level of declarations, I think that any international investigation of any case where civilians were killed, where innocent people were killed, is legitimate. And I would urge actually the Israeli government to cooperate. I think that if if the ICC or an international commission would ask for an inquiry, I think that all sides to the conflict should cooperate, including Israel. Obviously, this is where in asymmetrical conflicts, Israel might be severely judged because Hamas probably would not offer the same level of cooperation and would not offer the same level of documentation. But again, I think that as long as we would like to be considered as a law-abiding country, this is part of the burden that you have to bury and do it respectfully.
I have only one question, and this,
I think that Itamar wanted to add.
Okay, sorry, Itamar?
No, I just have a couple of short comments on issues that have been raised so far. So with regard to the question about negotiations with Hamas that came up here earlier on, I just want to indicate that at this point in time, I want to take Professor Barzilai's words a little bit further and say that at this point in time, parties, fortunately or unfortunately, are negotiating with Hamas, including Israel behind the scenes, including the Americans behind the scenes. This is more or less a known fact. It has to do with the coronavirus as well, in terms of the management of that period of time. And further, after we have reached this point where Abbas, for his reasons related to Israel or not related to Israel, had postponed the elections, I think that Sinwar is slated to become a leader in all of the territory. So in my personal opinion, once again, it is not a tenable position to take to say that we should not negotiate with Hamas. Hamas is an organization that is, seemingly responsible for war crimes in these contexts. This is not about legitimizing Hamas. It's about a realpolitik of what actually are the processes that are happening on the ground, and how can we reduce violence, and how can we encourage stability in the area. With regard to the comments about targeting that came up here by Dr. Neufeld, I just want to say, I think these issues are very illuminating, but I think it's also very important to keep in mind the general context in which we're dealing with a territory that since 2007 and 2009 is under a siege on the territorial side and under a naval blockade on the maritime side. So it is basically under a constant policy of reducing or eliminating movement, as well as trade and the movement of goods, all designed purportedly for military ends. And I think that it's misleading. And this happens among critics of Israel, and it happens among supporters of Israel as well. It's misleading to simply look at instances of targeting and bombings as the war that is going on here. We need to, if we're thinking about this military conflict in general, we have to keep in mind the context of this very exceptional military measure that is being imposed during a protracted period and seemingly more or less, you know, I don't want to say permanently, but in a very prolonged period of time for now well over a decade. I think that needs to be kept in mind in the general picture as well.
To respond to Professor Barzilai initiative about the International Committee, can you really see the establishment of this kind of committee, international committee?
Well, there is a decision by the UN Human Rights Council. I'm not sure that I'm using the correct title. Itamar and Robert can correct me. So such a committee of inquiry would be established. I should say that actually Israel heretofore has quite a good record in international law, which is much against the bias in the sense that the Goldstone report has pointed to several possibilities of war crimes committed by Israel, but has not claimed that Israel is a country which is committing war crime. There is a difference between pointing to concrete issues and other issues. And I can give you other examples from an international law perspective, including the Palmer report about the siege on Gaza. And as Itamar mentioned, the siege on Gaza is different perspectives. Some of it is obviously quite problematic. So personally, I've no doubt that the war in Gaza would be investigated by agencies of international law. I'm not sure about the ICC, because regarding the ICC, there are also issues of jurisdiction. And I think that once it happens, that the Israeli government should cooperate.
I just want to, so the issue of the way Israeli investigates the question of war crimes is to refer this to a committee, the Israeli committee, the Turkel committee, which examined how Israel examines or investigates alleged war crimes. So it's kind of unique, I think, hello? Yeah.
Yeah,
it's kind of unique committee, and you see around the world, I don't know many of these, that actually gave like a solid investigation and inquiry and in a comparative perspective as to the steps that Israel as a sovereign nation, a rule-abiding nation, should examine alleged war crimes. Okay, so first of all, I think the most important thing is that a country, a state, should have her own mechanism. That's the starting point. Even for the ICC to investigate, for any outside body. First of all, it is very important that the state will have its own mechanisms which are independent and are sufficiently qualified and have the tools and to conclude whether there were actually war crimes or not. As to the international environment, as you and the distinguished ambassadors here are probably also aware, Israel claims to be, other biased situation, and sometimes it's a lose-lose situation for Israel to decide to cooperate or not. So I really leave it open, but unfortunately, I don't see the Goldstone Committee, for example, as something which is a very good example for, personally, I don't see it as a good example for an outside investigation. I do believe that even if it's an unbiased, anti-Israeli committee, so to say, like the Human Rights Council, it is always important, here I agree with Gadi, to look into the allegations and to look into the investigation, and where there are things to learn from it and things to investigate. Yes, that point, a state, a foreign state, a rule-abiding state should take all necessary measures. I wish that an international body could really look into things in a very more unbiased way. But so far, at least as to the Human Rights Council, I wouldn't say that's the situation. You can see even at the headline or the committee that will be established has to examine, first of all, the question of alleged Israeli crimes, and that's a pity in my view, my personal view.
I'd like to add a note on this question, if I can. So I think that it's important to keep in mind a perspective that in international legal scholarship we call transnational legal process. So there's this perspective highlights that there's always a kind of dialogue between international organizations and actors from the international community and the internal perspective within a nation, within a sovereign state. So with regard to the Goldstone report, the Goldstone report is from 2010, and I think that Dr. Neufeld hinted on a critique of the Goldstone report, but I think it also should be noted that the Turkel Committee, which Dr. Neufeld affirmed as an example of the rule of law in the context of Israel, is very much a response. It's in 2011 and very much comes as a response to the Goldstone report. So there is a way in which the international community can have an influence internally that pushes towards rule of law in the internal perspective and towards further protection of human rights in the internal perspective. I very much agree that many findings of the Turkel Committee were extraordinarily important in terms of articulating the principles of the rule of law in conflict in the context of Gaza. However, when we are reaching this moment in time, I think it's also worth highlighting that many of the Turkel Committee recommendations were not implemented. And one of them has to do with a point that I alluded to earlier, namely the protracted siege, which the Turkel Committee in 2011 writes, with the regard to the duration of the economic warfare, there is a danger that comprehensive restrictions on goods may not be regarded as proportionate indefinitely. So there's a problem with proportionality when the duration becomes a kind of indefinite duration. And indeed, this is what we're seeing right now. And so I think that there's a room for another push from the international community that will hopefully trigger that same transnational legal process in order to further articulate rule of law and human rights principles within the domestic Israeli context. I'm not naive about the international community. I don't think that any actor in the international community is necessarily objective or neutral. That does not exist. These bodies represent sovereign states and their political interests. However, in the particular context where we are living right now, there are certain aspects of protection for human rights that are not implemented and can be made perhaps further enforced through routes that belong both to the domestic sovereign entity and to the international community at one and the same time.
Dr. Mann, I have one question. Why do you think that Israel didn't destroy Hamas totally? What is your opinion? By your opinion, why Israel didn't destroy Hamas? We have all possibilities to do that.
To destroy what?
Destroyed Hamas totally.
Yeah. Well, this is a matter of political analysis more than a legal determination. On the basic legal aspect, Israel is, I think it is more or less the accepted vision, and also my perspective, that Israel is allowed to target Hamas militants, including high military officers. There was an attempt to target Mohammed Deif, for example. And so Israel did do a lot of targeting. It's not that Israel did not do targeting. On the other hand, why did it not go further than that? Well, from a legal perspective, one first has to put on the table the principle of distinction. So, for example, in my view, it would be very different to target Yahya Sinwar in comparison with Mohammed Deif, because he is the political leader. And of course, as a matter of command responsibility, he may have responsibility for certain military actions, but still his main capacity is the political leader of an organization that is in conflict with Israel, but not as a military person. So that's the perspective of international law, the perspective of the principle of distinction, as well as the perspective of proportionality that I think that Dr. Neufeld really articulated, strongly here. As a matter of a strategy, I think, well, there is a legal matter that relates to the matter of strategy, and that is to say, what is the legitimate military goal of targeting? And so one version of this would be to say that military targeting must eliminate a concrete danger, like a missile facility, or an arms, a center for the production of arms or whatever. So there's a concrete military objective. I think that's the more usual perspective of international law. Another position would be to say, okay, we have within the military objective also an authorization to deter, in other words, to make the enemy fearful towards the future. And we have a kind of legitimate objective to prevent the preparation and arming of the enemy, or of the party with whom we're fighting in hostilities, also into the future, rather than in a concrete way. And I think the latter is much more problematic, is much more controversial as a matter of law, where the former is solid and indeed permissible by international legal standards. But ultimately, all this, I think, is really, besides the main point, which is a political point, and is, as far as I can understand, that Israel does not want Gaza to remain without effective control. Israel wants Gaza to continue to have a certain measure of effective control in order for it not to turn into a kind of humanitarian catastrophe even further than it is, a chaos, something that might inflict Israelis with further dangers, including environmental dangers, including humanitarian, refugees or other forms of danger that might occur when there's really no effective control over the territory. So ultimately, I think this was the calculation. We need some measure of control over there, and if we simply destroy the whole infrastructure, we're not going to have that, and we're going to have we're going to further destabilize the area in a very considerable and grave way.
Yeah, let me just add. So I think that the whole notion of destroying Hamas is a myth. I don't think that such an option really exists. I mean, it's good for the media. It's good in order to make some segments of the Israeli public more enthusiastic, but it's really completely a myth. First of all, from a legal perspective, declaring a total war on Hamas does mean inflicting massive number of casualties among Palestinians and among Israelis, and probably such a warfare would escalate into the West Bank and probably would inflame the front with Syria and Lebanon. So from a legal perspective, it seems to me an avenue which may lead Israel into a destructive posture from a legal perspective. Now, from a political perspective, I don't think that Israel would like to destroy Hamas, even though such an option does not really exist. Because destroying Hamas would mean to lose a check and balance against the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and destroying Hamas, which again, it's not really a possibility, does mean to have either Iranian troops on the border with Israel or Daesh or any other organization. I don't know of any serious military or political authority or academic authority which can point to the question, what happens if Hamas will be so-called destroyed? Now, from a military perspective, it's going to be very costly because you cannot do it through air bombardments. You have to invade. And I don't know of any politician, certainly not Netanyahu. Netanyahu by nature is a risk-averse politician. And by the way, not as right-wing as Israel might have. And I don't think that Netanyahu would like to take a responsibility for the casualties which a ground invasion would entail. So just last sentence, if I could advise the Israeli government, I would say, just drop that rhetorical argument of destroying Hamas. It doesn't really exist. Such a possibility is completely a myth, and focus on negotiations with the Palestinians in order to find a political solution to the Israeli rule under on Palestinian territories. This should be the key issue.
I would like just to add.
My question. Oh, sorry, Robert. Go ahead.
Just a sentence or two just to clarify my position in this. And here I see very much like Itamar and Gadi. First of all, there's a difference between the political aims of war and the question of like targeting and selection of targets. Okay, the selection of targets, whether human or military objective, should also always be done. And here, Itamar, fully agree with you on the question of whether there's a concrete military objective which is gives you a military advantage. There's effective contribution to the military action, and put aside the issue of what political goals that you gain. Sometimes, and here's just a nuance here, a political leader can also be what we call under international IHL, international humanitarian law, also a direct participant in hostilities, DPH, if his actions or his position in the decision that he's making has a direct effect on the actions of the military actions of the other side. Being a political leader does not render you as a military objective. That will not be the issue, and it must not be the issue. Some political leaders, and especially in organizations which are not very clear and cut the way they divide the responsibilities inside them, sometimes they are mixed and making also military decisions too. I'm not referring to Sinwar. I don't know in this case, in the case of Sinwar, whether he's qualified or not. But the question is, does he also have what to say? I would say so. Impact on decision making on the military decisions that the organization is taking. So that's as to the question of so the overall decision. And on the other aspects, I fully agree with Itamar and Gadi. Also, but destroying Hamas is a myth. There's no such it's a personal, it's not a legal issue for me. I think it's more like the way I read the map and the position that Hamas has in the Palestinian society, as a political power, a major political power, and this would be a myth to say these things. Whether you can or you cannot destroy its military capacities, it's another issue. And I also agree on the fact that it may be costly in many aspects, yet it may be a legitimate military operation. Okay, the question is, at the end of it, is it feasible to achieve that? But that's another issue.
One more question. Robert, what do you think, how Israel is open for the international investigation?
My opinion on the international investigation? Well, I may differ here with my friends a bit, mainly because of my background. I've seen
this is why I'm asking you.
Yeah, because unfortunately, I have not witnessed in many cases too much of the objectivity coming out from international bodies. Bodies like the UN Human Rights Council, which are unfortunately, very unfortunate for the whole world, focused on too much focused on this conflict here, while other atrocities are happening in other states members of that council without too much of reaction. It's a political body. I fully agree with Itamar, by the way, on the notion that international investigations, whether biased or not, do contribute at the end of it to the Israeli rule of law. I think it's very important in that way. This is why I said that we should learn from everything, and even biased or not, it's not something that you must put aside and say, I don't look at it. It doesn't interest me at all. If they say that there are crimes here, there's things that have to be learned and studied. But unfortunately, so far, I've seen introduction of new legal norms through this investigative. So-called investigative inquiries or whatever that have been. So it's always very difficult to see from whether they are actually implementing IHL, International Humanitarian Law, as it is, or just considering new norms, and which is also legitimate. Okay, it's very important. But introducing new norms into the into the conflict, this conflict, and maybe others that may follow. So the question of what is lex late, what is lex ferenda, what is the actually legal norms, and what is wish for norms is very difficult to understand from in that inquiry. You may be judged according to norms that are not, I would not say, are reflect IHL as it is. Okay, it may trigger a very good discussion, very important discussion as to the introduction of these norms in the future. Okay, there was a question of use of high explosives in urban neighborhoods. Okay, use of bombs, high explosive bombs in the artillery in that. But the question is whether that reflects law as it is, or a wishful thinking that you are judged accordingly. So that's a very good question.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Barzilai, what do you think, how deep the academy can be involved in the solving of the situation?
Well, I think that by and large, the Israeli academia is pretty involved in different issues regarding international law, regarding the Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza. And obviously there is not enough time, to organize in-depth conferences regarding the war in Gaza, and certainly not research or as of yet. I mean, you cannot do a serious research in a week or two. It takes much longer, notwithstanding the effect, the influence of academia on decision-making processes, on national decision-making processes in Israel, and by and large in other countries as well, is quite limited. I think that academics need to do research for the sake of science. If it may help decision makers, it's certainly very good, but I wouldn't expect too much to see influence of academia on decision-making processes if we are indeed very realistic about it. I think that usually politicians, and also, by the way, judges and justices, are referring to research which is justifying decisions which have been done already. It's not necessarily about research which is changing processes. It's quite rare, not only in Israel, but also in Israel.
Ambassador of Albania, would you like to add something?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the information you shared so far. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm not the ambassador. Unfortunately, the ambassador couldn't participate and attend the meeting. Anyway, I had two questions with regard to the insight of the speakers. I would like to follow up a little bit more on the proportionality of the military actions during the last conflict. Because as you all were aware, the international bodies showed a lot of concern on this aspect of international law, respect to the proportionality. I followed with interest the position of Professor Neufeld, Professor Mann, and also Professor Barzilai. Maybe someone of them can elaborate more on this aspect. How can you decide, how can you state what constitutes proportionality in such conflict? When you have civilians, when you have targets that are very difficult to be targeted, a military target to be targeted. So how that can be done? Does international law gives more answers to this question? Because sometimes it's a bit it creates more confusion, or it's more challenging to understand that you can really keep this proportionality in place. And secondly, personally, I do agree with what Professor Barzilai said about destruction of Hamas, which seems more like a myth than a realistic goal. But anyhow, is there, according to you, is there any possibility to have a long-standing ceasefire with Hamas? Is there any possibility that Israeli government gets into a long-standing and very comprehensive negotiation framework with Hamas in order to stop the casualties and the destruction and the humanitarian crisis that has been already created? How would you see this? If you can dwell a little bit more into this perspective, I would be very interested. And thank you to the Minerva Center for organizing this forum and having the possibility to also understand the legal aspect of the military intervention. Thank you.
So maybe because the expertise of Professor Mann and Dr. Neufeld is international law, they would refer to the proportionality. And then if I have any comment to add, I will do it at the end.
Robert, do you want to go for it first?
I'm going to try at least, and correct me then later on. But first of all, I would have to say you have to ask which proportionality are you referring to? Okay, under international law, there are different different proportionality tests in the different bodies of law. Okay. Proportionality, as you know, in the question of jus ad bellum, the question of the legitimacy of the military action as a whole is one thing, and proportionality, when you refer to as to the actual implementation of force, of targeting, for example, is it's a different issue. Okay, it's so. And there are the human rights law proportionality is another issue which is different, like by definition. Okay, I'll skip directly to the IHL, the International Humanitarian Laws of War proportionality. I think that's what you're referring to. It is drawn in a very general, if you wish, legal test, and it was deliberately chosen to be this way. The military advantage, the direct military advantage that you are gaining from that attack must not be excessive, and the word is specifically was chosen here in the additional protocol 1 as excessive to the collateral damage that you have caused. Okay, it's not like if you put it's because it's wartime. It's very difficult to assess whether you are like it's 51% or 49%. When is it? Does it shift? When it becomes unproportionate? So the idea was something that everybody is a very difficult thing to say in international law, but when you look at an action and it's clearly something that can't be done, it's too much of a price to pay for that military advantage, and that in legal. That would be constituted as something which is disproportionate. Now, proportionality is something which is very difficult to prove in the court of law. Not many cases around the world. If you look at in IHL courts, it's always easier to go to the question of distinction. You targeted civilians. Okay, that's easier to prove that you've been unproportionate. Because one of the things that when you consider proportionality and all our precautionary measures is what I said as to it is determined as to the facts that you did know or you should have known when you make that specific decision to attack. Okay, your intelligence says that there is one civilian in that house, and that the military target is there, and you make your decision about the proportionality, and you find out retroactively that there were 10 or 20, that will not make you a war criminal per se, okay? I put aside the question that Gadi, for example, raised in this issue, whether that question, in this incident, there should be an examination, an independent examination of this every such situation, okay? I put aside the question of examination or investigation that should be made in these questions, but as to the general legal decision, this is why they say about international humanitarian law and laws of war that are very simple principles and very difficult implementation of them. The examples I brought you were just to draw to explain, which I'm in so many words I will not be able to, the difficulties of making a decision about proportionality in such an environment such as which is very densely populated environment such as Gaza. So that is as to the legal standard of proportionality. And it also another thing is, which is interlinked with this, that proportionality is only the last decision that you make, legally speaking. You have to make all feasible precautions before that or before the attack. For example, one precaution should be, if you're not risking the military, achieving the military objective, like targeting the weapon cache in that mosque, for example, you should give an advance and effective warning. So, okay, so you should try to evacuate every civilian and to in order to still gain your military objective while limiting the collateral damage. And the end of it, after you have done all what you can, and it's very situation related, what is feasible, that's the wording, the correct wording. You've done everything feasible for you, because always in the war there's the fog of war and you cannot know everything, and the measures that you have are inherently limited. After done everything feasible, only that at that time you decide about the proportionality of the attack or not. Okay, so that's the IHL proportionality test. I'm not referring to the question whether in that case was it proportionate or not. I'll leave it to you. Another thing which is long been said about proportionality, I guess every one of this room will be given a certain situation, may get to a different conclusion as to the question of whether it's proportionate to attack in that case or not. What is the price or the collateral damage that you may pay, you want to pay for, you think it won't be excessive, again, to achieving that military advantage. So that's the problem with proportionality as it is, and as it is to be implemented.
Other questions?
Yeah, did I answer this as well, or quickly, or how are we with time? Because I do have a couple of different, slightly different emphases. So very quickly, I'll be very brief. But generally, I agree with everything that was said. I agree with what Dr. Neufeld said. But I do have one, I think, major adjustment, which is to say that for many countries today, including Israel, according to this Supreme Court, the application of IHL is not exclusive. There's always a kind of double or parallel application of international humanitarian law alongside human rights law. And so the differentiation that was presented, according to which IHL applies separately from human rights law proportionality, is questionable in my view, as to whether it reflects current understandings of law, even in Israel. And so I think a very dominant view is to say that in the context of targeting specifically, human rights law always needs to be in the background in terms of providing options for action that don't amount to the use of military force. And this is articulated most clearly in the targeted killing case that Aharon Barak had authored historically and now is very, very influential around the world. And I think that in the context of Gaza specifically, the parallel application has to do with another major background question, which is the question whether Gaza is an occupied territory. As you may know, according to several international organizations, this is also the interpretation of the International Criminal Court, Gaza is still an occupied territory after 2005, which means that Israel owes a kind of duty of a kind of governing duty towards the occupied, protected population. This is not my personal position. I don't find that particularly convincing because of this issue of no boots on the ground. But I do think that this indeterminate and indefinite situation of siege does render Israel more limited in terms of its respect to human rights norms that are underlying this whole discussion. And I think that one context, you know, when this came up recently in the recent conflict that we experienced was the context of the Jallah Tower, which was the tower where Al Jazeera, as well as the Associated Press, are housed. And I think that there was, I'm not able to say much about the facts because I don't have the access, you know, to the facts beyond what was published publicly. But I do know that there was a debate on whether apartments that are in the same building with a military target are effectively part of the military target or not, and whether they need to be considered as a damage that is collateral damage or part of the targeting itself. How should they be weighed in the proportionality calculus? And in this context, for example, I think that it makes sense to take into account these apartments as civilian and not part of the military context, and therefore render the ability to strike an entire tower like this and basically raise it down not a possibility that is legitimate prima facie. Of course, there could be information that is not accessible in the public domain according as to what the military target there was. I'm just reminding that the reports did indicate that the computers were removed from the tower, and therefore, and it seems that those were in fact the military target, and so that would seem to be a suspect or at least a questionable attack inside this entire campaign. So to make a long story short, I just want to insist on the parallel applicability of human rights in the context of Gaza because of the condition of indefinite siege.
Other questions? Other questions? I think we will appreciate the Minerva Center for this discussion meeting, and I think we have to do more. Let's meet more, and probably we will organize some visit to the center, to Haifa University, and we are really appreciating you, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much to the ambassadors and to you, Julia, and obviously to my colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.